As we get closer to the presidential election, there has been a lot of chatter about whether polls can be trusted. Of course, we know that in 2016, many of the polls called the election for Hillary Clinton. We now know that President Trump was the winner. And so there are questions this year if potentially there could be a similar upset. Now, of course, these two elections are different in the numbers that we're seeing in a lot of the polls, but one of the reasons that researchers have been looking at as to why polls may end up not being entirely correct is this idea of self-censorship, that people in 2020 are too nervous to tell the truth about who they're voting for, and so the polls are not entirely accurate. So in this video, I'm going to talk about two studies that have looked at different reasons for this, but I'd like to know, what do you think? Are you self-censoring right now? And do you feel like if you were a participant in one of these polls that they wouldn't be getting an accurate assessment of who you're going to vote for? I'm interested to hear how you are approaching talking about this election with not just your family, but strangers at the grocery store. Do you tend to keep quiet what your political beliefs are, and why do you do that? Again, if you'd like to support my work, as always, there are links in the description. There's Patreon, there's PayPal, but it does always just help if you like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell icon for notifications when I upload new videos. Let's get to this first study. This is called Keeping Your Mouth Shut, Spiraling Self-Censorship in the United States by James Gibson of Washington University in St. Louis and Joseph Sutherland of Columbia University. So they say here at the beginning, in the heyday of McCarthyism to the present, the percentage of the American people not feeling free to express their views has tripled. In 2019, fully 4 in 10 Americans engaged in self-censorship. They talk that mostly micro-environment sentiments are what are causing this issue. So not like a repressive government, but that people are worried that expressing their unpopular views will isolate and alienate people from their friends, family, and neighbors, and that seems to drive self-censorship. So I'll put the link for this in the description. You can look at how they figured out the statistics that I'm about to read to you. But basically they're saying that as polarization has increased, so has the trend towards self-censorship. This is what they looked at. Does self-censorship relate to growing effective political polarization? In other words, that because people so dislike each other and detest each other's views and values, they perceive a great cost associated with sharing their opinions publicly for little or no reward. So is that social cost, like you're afraid you're going to lose your job, or you're afraid that your parents are going to stop talking to you, or your husband, your wife, your kids? And so this idea that we are far more polarized has, though, put us in echo chambers in some cases where we're often now more likely to be talking to people who are like-minded, say for instance on the internet, wherever you're conversing on social media platforms. It says right here, as polarization has increased, so too has self-censorship. It seems that one casualty of rising effective polarization has been the loss of considerable quantities of freedom to speak. Now, they also looked at this idea of increasing political intolerance. So are we becoming more intolerant of each other, and thereby we just don't want to speak our minds anymore? But actually, according to their data, it says that there has actually been a significant decrease in political intolerance in the US over the last several decades, that decreasing levels of political intolerance cannot account for increasing levels of unwillingness to speak one's minds. They do say, though, that it may be that national trends are of little consequence because individuals are affected by the intolerance of their local communities, not the nation as a whole, but then go on to basically say no relationship whatsoever exists between community intolerance and self-censorship. Again, basically going back to this idea that they said earlier, that it's actually these micro relationships, your family and people you're very close to, that are more likely prompting self-censorship. The next part that they looked at is demographic and education. Here they say among those with no high school diploma, 27% self-censor. The comparable figures for those with only a high school degree and at least some college are 34% and 45% respectively. This finding is revealing. It suggests that learning to keep one's mouth shut is in part a function of increasing socialization, learning what views are and especially what views are not appropriate to express. It also suggests that self-censorship is not mainly a function of a lack of resources in the sense that one may keep quiet because of insecurity about one's own views. Self-censorship is more common in metro areas than in non-metro areas. And then it also says there's no relationship now between holding more extreme views and self-censorship. that self-censorship is unrelated to age, income, whether one owns one's lodging, and race, and that self-censorship is somewhat more common among women, 43%, than among men, 37%. They end by saying that the people who are self-censoring are not necessarily people who have limited political resources, for instance, that actually people with higher education levels are more likely to self-censor. As you heard them say also, though, that having a more extreme view does not mean that you're going to be more likely to self-censor. Now, that is not necessarily the case according to the Cato Institute, which is the next study that I'm going to show you. Now, the Cato Institute is a libertarian outlet, so I'll just say that to begin with and take this as you will. But the poll they have is 62% of Americans say they have political views they are afraid to share. A new Cato national survey finds that self-censorship is on the rise in the United States. That goes along with that last study I told you about. Nearly two-thirds, 62% of Americans say the political climate these days prevents them from saying things they believe because others might find them offensive. The share of Americans who self-censor has risen several points since 2017, when 58% of Americans agreed with this statement. So here's where it gets interesting, is how this changes depending on whether you're a liberal or a conservative, and whether you're a strong liberal or a strong conservative. And you see here, this is their graph. What it shows is that the strong liberal is the most likely to feel free to speak their mind, and the strong conservative is the least likely to share their political opinion. And so you see the lines right here. Essentially, 42% of strong liberals agree with the statement that the political climate these days prevents me from saying things I believe because others might find them offensive. And 77% of strong conservatives agree with that same statement. Vice versa, 58% of strong liberals disagree that the political climate these days prevents me from saying things I believe that others might find offensive, and 23% of strong conservatives disagree with that statement. And then they go on to talk about how people are concerned about losing their jobs if their political viewpoints went public, and that if you're younger, you're more likely to be concerned about losing employment because of your political views. Now, scrolling down a little bit further here, this I find to be really interesting. 50% of strong liberals support firing Trump donors. 36% of strong conservatives support firing Biden donors. So they're saying that essentially the survey found many Americans think a person's private political donations should impact their employment. Nearly a quarter, 22% of Americans would support firing a business executive who personally donates to Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden's campaign. Even more, 31% support firing a business executive who donates to Donald Trump's re-election campaign. That support rises among political subgroups. Support increases to 50% of strong liberals who support firing executives who personally donate to Trump, and more than a third, 36% of strong conservatives support firing an executive for donating to Biden's presidential campaign. Curious, what do you think about this? Again, this study as well, I will put in the description if you want to read it for yourself. Do you self-censor? Do you think self-censoring is affecting the results of the current polls? Who do you think is going to win the election? I want to hear from you in the comments. Again, there are ways for you to support my work in the description. Like, share, subscribe, and I will see you next time.